This is section 3.2, and we're going to look at solving quadratic equations, the various methods that we might use to do that. So when we think about quadratics, we have to remember that they could have no solutions in the real number system, and that graph would be one that doesn't touch the x-axis. They could have one solution that's repeated, and that's when the vertex hits the x-axis but doesn't go through it. Or we could have two solutions, which crosses and comes back up. So you can solve them by a variety of methods: factoring, square root property, completing the square, or the quadratic formula. You can also solve them on your calculator. We'll talk about that later, but for this chapter, you're going to be doing these various methods. So just a reminder, we should know how to factor when we get to college algebra, but let's do one of the easiest I could come up with, just to talk about the process again. So you have an equation equal to 0. You always want it to be equal to 0. You factor this part. Find the two things that will factor to give you that. So x and x, we know that. You're looking at 1 and you're saying, what are the two numbers that would multiply to give us 1? Well, that's super easy. So it's 1 and 1. If it is a positive here, then it's got to be either both negative or both positive. Since we need negative in the middle, it's negative. So we have both those factored. We set each of those factors equal to 0, and we get two solutions, except it's repeated. So it's really one solution repeated, x equals 1 and x equals 1. On this one, for factoring, it's not equal to 0, so the very first thing I have to do is subtract 1 over here. So now I've got 2x squared plus 2x minus 12 equals 0. And you always want to try to make it easy on yourself. And I look at this and see even numbers. So I could divide everything by 2. That leaves me x squared plus x minus 6, and we still have 0 over here. Now, same process. We're going to look at this negative 6 and say, what are the numbers that could multiply to give me 6? There's two options, 6 and 1 or 2 and 3. And you want to think about which of these could add or subtract to give me a 1 in the middle. 6 and 1 doesn't work. 6 and 1, either if you add it, you get 7, you subtract, you get 5. So that one doesn't work. So we're going to choose 2 and 3. So we have 2 and 3 here. If it's a negative value, different than up here, you're going to have one negative and one positive. And we're trying to get a positive in the middle. So if we make this a plus 3 and this a minus 2, and you think about FOIL, so you've got a positive 3x and a minus 2x. That does leave you 1x in the middle. Take each of those and set them equal to 0. You get x is 2 and x is negative 3. Those are your two solutions for that one. All right, let's look at the square root property. So the square root property is when you do not have an x term to deal with. You've got x squared equals a number. If you take the square root of both sides, you get plus or minus a value. If it's a perfect square, like here, you'd get x is plus or minus 7. But if it's not a perfect square, you might have plus or minus the square root of 3. All right, let's look at this example. 100 minus 16t squared equals 0. Normally, we would move the constant over here, but that leaves negatives, and you just got to get rid of the negatives anyway. So I'm going to add the 16t squared to this side. Then I want to isolate this t squared, so I'm going to divide both sides by 16. I'm left with 100 over 16 equals t squared. I note that both of those are perfect squares. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides. That's the square root of 100 over 16, which gives me 10 over 4. We have plus or minus, but that does reduce to 5 halves. So your answer is plus or minus 5 over 2. If the icon does not exist in a problem where you could just choose plus minus like that, then you need to separately list those, a positive one and a negative one. All right, we have done a little bit of completing the square in the previous section, so let's talk about it in terms of solving. Okay, so in the other ones, when we were doing that in the last section, we had an f of x that we turned into a y. In this, we don't have a y at all. We have a quadratic equaling 0. So that's the first thing that's basic difference. So we're going to move the constant over just like we did in the previous section. Now we've got x squared minus 8x plus a box equals negative 9 plus a box. You're going to take half of the negative 8, that's negative 4. Negative 4 squared is 16. 16 goes in that box and that box. If you combine those, you get 7. If you rewrite this as a single factor squared, it's x. You match this sign and whatever the 4 was, which we've matched that sign there. So that's there. Now we have x minus 4 squared equals 7. This is like that square root property. Take the square root of both sides. You get x minus 4 equals plus or minus square root of 7. We can't do anything else with that. Add the 4 over. Here are your two answers. 4 plus the square root of 7, 4 minus the square root of 7. We also have the quadratic formula, which most everybody learned in high school. And so usually we use that when we can't factor. It's a wonderful method. It's going to always work whether your answers are imaginary or real. You should be able to use this. So 3x squared minus 6x plus 2 equals 0. That doesn't factor. Here's the quadratic formula, and a is the first term, b second, c here. So a is 3, b is negative 6, c is 2. I wrote the formula down again, and then I plugged in all the pieces, putting things in parentheses when I needed to. Then you start cleaning it up. This becomes a positive 6. This becomes 36. Minus 12 times 2 is 24 over 6. Ultimately, I have 6 plus or minus the square root of 12 over 6. Then, need to move this, didn't mean to move it that much, over a little bit. You want to simplify this square root of 12 because it has a perfect square in it. It's square root of 4 times square root of 3. That becomes 2, so you have 2 square roots of 3. Then you substitute this for the square root of 12. So now I have this. And if there's a number that will go into all three of these, you can simplify further. So 2 goes there and leaves 1. 2 goes there, leaves 3, and 3. So your answer would be here. Okay. The last thing that we want to talk about is the discriminant. And the discriminant is something that helps you determine how many solutions and what kind they are. So it's just b squared minus 4ac. It's that inner part of the quadratic formula. And if it's positive, you have 2 real solutions. If it's equal to 0, you have 1 real solution. And if it's negative, you have imaginary. There's no real solutions. You have 2 imaginary. And so this is where your discriminant is less than 0. This is where it's equal to 0. This is where it's greater than 0. So let's go look at our problems and see how we're going to apply this. Okay, let's see what we've got. Number 1, x squared equals 36. This is that square root property method. So you just take the square root of both sides and you get x equals plus or minus 6. You're going to put those in the box like this with a comma between. There's no parentheses there. Number 2, x squared plus 5 equals 0. So let's move the 5 to the other side. So we have x squared is negative 5. And that's plus or minus the square root of negative 5. And at this point, we're not dealing with imaginary numbers, so we say there are no real solutions with the negative inside there. Number 3, All right, let's see how to solve this one. 1/5 x squared minus 3 equals 0. Let's add the 3 to the other side, and we have 1/5 x squared equals 3. When you need to divide by a fraction, you flip it and multiply. So we're going to multiply 5 over 1 on both sides. Those cancel out. We're left with x squared. And on the other side, we have 15. So now we'll say x, take the square root there, and the square root of 15. So plus or minus square root of 15. Number 4, excuse me, t squared plus 3t minus 10 equals 0. So what are the numbers that multiply to give you 10? It's either 10 and 1 or 5 and 2. And which of those two options could give you 3 in the middle? That's 5 and 2. So we know that we're going to have one positive, one negative, and we need to have a positive in the middle. So 5t, positive 5t, minus 2t. That would give me a positive 3t in the middle. Take each of those factors, set them equal to 0, and solve. So you get negative 5 and positive 2. Those go right here. Same thing with number 5. When we factor it, we get x plus 2 and x plus 2. That gives us x equals negative 2 repeated, and you only put it once in the box. All right, x times 5x plus 3. So you need to get this to be 0. So let's go ahead and first distribute this x, and that gives us 5x squared plus 3x equals 2. Now we'll subtract the 2 so that we have it equaling 0. At that point, we can factor. So we have 5x and x. We know that. The things that can multiply to give us 2 are only 2 and 1. We're trying to get a 3 in the middle. Positive 5x minus 2x would give us the 3x. So that works. And it really is trial and error. If it didn't work the first way I try it, then I try it the other way. You always want to check yourself. Then 5x minus 2 is 0. 5x is 2. Divide by the 5 and you get x is 2/5. For this one, you have x is negative 1. So those are our two solutions there. All right, number 7, we're talking about the discriminant a little bit here. Consider 4x squared equals 16. Write the equation as 4x squared plus as ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. That means we need to get that 16 over here. And we have a is 4, c is 16. We don't have an x term, so b is 0. So if we do the discriminant, first they want that equation, and we put it here. Be sure you put the equals 0. That makes it an equation. If you just put 4x squared minus 16, it will count it wrong. So over here, I'm calculating b squared minus 4ac, and we get a positive 256. So that's the value of the discriminant. A positive value tells you you have two real solutions. We got that. C part, they want you to go ahead and solve it. So here, 4x squared, we'll put the 16 over here. Divide by 4. We have x squared equals 4. X is the plus or minus the square root of 4, which is plus or minus 2. And there's our solutions. You're going to do the same thing with number 8. You do have A, B, and C here. So we've got this as our equation. So that goes in that box. We move to the 49 over, and we have it equaling 0. And then we're going to do the discriminant. So it's b squared minus 4ac. That ends up being 196 minus 196, which gives us 0. So the discriminant is 0, and if it's 0, you only have one real solution. When we solve it, we know we're just going to get a repeated root. And what multiplies to give you 49? 7 and 7, and that will add up to 14, and you get x is 7 is your solution. Number 9, a baseball is dropped from a stadium seat that's 77 feet above the ground. Its height, s, in feet, after t seconds is given by, so here's our equation, s of t, where t is seconds. How long is it going to take for the baseball to strike the ground? Well, remember it says s is the height. Well, the height on the ground is 0. So I made that note there. So we take 77 minus 16t squared equals 0. Now let's solve that. Subtract the 77 here. Divide by negative 16. So you have two negatives. That becomes positive. Take the square root of that and get your answer. Let's do that on the calculator. Let me show you that on the calculator. Okay, so we're taking the square root of 77 over 16. So here's something I want to show you. So we're going to do second and the x squared key. That gives us the radical. Now I want that to be a fraction in there. I could just do 77 divided by, but remember we have that little trick. Alpha and the y equals, and hit enter for the first one, which is fraction. So now I can put 77 there, hit my side arrow, it takes me down here, I get a 16, and I hit enter, and that gives me that number, but it says round to the nearest tenth, so that would be 2.2. So that's how you can do it on your calculator. And because it's a square root, we've been saying it's plus or minus, but because we're talking about time, we ignore the negative option. All right, number 10. Number 10, I think, is our last one. Translate to a quadratic equation and then solve with the quadratic formula. So the length of a rectangular air filter is 4 inches less than twice the width. Find the length and width of the filter if the area is 286. So they gave us quite a few things. Best thing to do is to start with a picture. And everything seems to be in terms of the width. So I'm going to let the width be x and x. We know they're the same because it's a rectangle and opposite sides are equal. The length is 4 inches less than twice. So that's 2 times the width minus 4. So there's my dimensions for the rectangle. Then we know the area is 286. Well, the area is length times width. So I wrote down the length and the width. I distributed that x, so I've got an equation like this. Well, they told me the area was 286, so I take my equation that I came up with, equals 286. Subtract that 286 over here, equals 0. Remember I talked about even numbers, especially if this is a 2. Divide everything by 2. That leaves you x squared minus 2x minus 143. And 143 factors with 11 and 13. If you didn't know that, you could do some trial and error. But we came up with 11 and 13. And solve each of those, you get x is negative 11, x is 13. We can't have a negative width, so we discard that one. And the width is 13. We needed the length as well. So the length is 2 times 13, which is 26, minus 4. That's 22. So we did that. This said use solving the quadratic formula, and I factored it. Quadratic formula would work fine. You could do that. I did it the other way. So either way, because you're not showing your work on that one, that would be fine. So I think that'll get you going on solving quadratics.